there is a lot of political abuse today, but I do think a more targeted response is necessary. One of my favorite examples of a successful pro-freedom movement in history is Richard Cobden's Anti-Corn Law League, which managed to accomplish the repeal of the British Corn Laws, which were essentially price controls on grain, import restrictions that...
Wheat, corn, etc.
Yes, corn was a generic term that was used for
It didn't
all
apply
grains.
just to corn.
Yes. And it was intended to keep the prices of grain above a certain level.
It was essentially a mercantilist policy.
Yes, to protect, allegedly, British farmers and the very powerful landlords that generally rented the land to these farmers.
Yes, the idea was keep the wealth in the country.
Now, Richard Cobden organized a very broad-based coalition to oppose the Corn Laws, and he was relentlessly focused on this one issue.
And he was so articulate and well-spoken. Of course, most things written back then were of a much higher level of discourse than anything you see today. But he made his case so clearly and with such delicate force.
Yes.
One might say refined force.
He was extremely civil. He refused to engage in any kind of abusive tactics. And actually, he routinely faced heckling at his meetings.
Yes, but he would never return in kind.
Right. And he said, essentially, that he extends an invitation to opponents to come to the meetings and debate him peacefully. But he won't tolerate any kind of violence at the meetings, and he will also not respond in kind. He also, as a way to get at the Corn Laws, actually decided to challenge some of the corruption that was going on in Britain at the time, because the supporters of the Corn Laws would frequently bribe electors. And back then in Britain, the electoral system was not a one-man, one-vote system. There were certain districts where only some people were eligible to vote, and sometimes districts where if you captured just a few electors, you could elect a person to parliament. There was a lot of bribery going on of these electors. And so what the Anti-Corn Law League did was it set up huge rewards for reporting anybody who engaged in electoral bribery.
A kind of anti-fraud commission.
Yes. So that the reward for reporting a bribe was much higher than any bribe one would receive. And as a result, electoral corruption was greatly diminished, and people who opposed the Corn Laws were elected into office.
Where did Richard Cobden get the funds to do that?
He was a textile manufacturer in northern England. And
he had succeeded at that?
Yes. His annual income would have been a few $1,000,000
by today's standards.
And
so very wealthy.
Yes.
At the time.
And he also was associated with an orator named John Bright. They were both elected to Parliament on occasion. And
I love that. Elected to Parliament on occasion.
Yes. Well, sometimes they got voted out of office because they had other unpopular positions, like opposition to the Crimean War, for instance.
Oh, how dare they!
But they kept essentially pushing this one issue. And at first, the votes in favor of the Corn Laws were overwhelming. I wrote a paper on Richard Cobden's movement, so I've done a lot of research.
So you have a soft spot for Cobden.
Yes. I've done a lot of research on how essentially they got to their goal. And it's interesting. Every year they introduced that bill in Parliament, the vote count shifted ever so slightly in their favor. Except in the last year.
Trying.
Yes, in the last year it was an overwhelming shift, and they got the Tory Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, eventually to agree with them. Even though Robert Peel for a long time was a strong supporter of the Corn Laws, he considered himself a kind of economic expert, and he bought into a lot of the protectionist arguments, but eventually even Robert Peel was convinced, and he decided to put his career on the line. He knew, because the Tories were the party that supported the Corn Laws, he knew that his decision to oppose them would create a fracture within the Conservative Party, and once the Conservative Party split, he would lose the Prime Minister position, and the Liberal Party would get into the majority. But he essentially gave up his career in order to enact this repeal. That's how powerful Cobden's message was.
That's remarkable that a politician would be willing to do that. What integrity? You don't really see that today, you know?
Yes.
I'm not trying to bemoan the good old days of the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, but okay, maybe a little bit. Maybe I am.
There was a lot of very intelligent discourse about the
There were a
Corn
lot
Law
of
issue.
problems too, of course, and I would never trade my existence in the present for an existence in the 18th or 19th centuries. I think that what we have gained far exceeds what we have lost, but I do miss what we have lost.